So we're comparing the PKM and the Bruen and seeing which one comes out on top. We're going to look at movement, ADS speed, recoil, reload time, and all the various different things that go into the weapon, bullet velocity, range, time to kill, DPS, everything, and find out which one actually comes out on top, especially with the nerf to the Bruen, which you can see on screen. They reduced the damage range, which didn't really impact the bullet damage or the rate of fire or anything. The TTK pretty much stayed the same, but instead of going up to a certain range, that range was nerfed, so it brought down a little bit. And that's basically all that happened. So we're going to take a look at that and see where these weapons stack up against each other. If you enjoyed the video, learned something new, please do me a favor, hit that like button. If you're brand new, want to find your way back for more Call of Duty content, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. And then also by the end of the video, go ahead and comment down below, are you team PKM or team Bruen? Let's get into the breakdown. So the first thing we're going to look at is a comparison on their movement speed. You can see right here, they're fairly even, but obviously with the different time at the top, you could see that the PKM ends up coming up slightly slower. We're going to see all these numbers represented as data, but I did want to go show you the visuals of what is actually happening in the side to side and how big a difference those numbers actually are. Because at the end of the day, a number is just a number until you can see how it's represented in game. So that's the first thing we're going to look at. Now let's go ahead and look at the aim down sight speed. I can kind of re-loop that for you so you guys can see that over and over. And generally, it's not a huge difference. You can kind of see how quick that was. It's only a few frames apart. This is with this particular optic. This is a holographic sight. If you put on the VLK, the Bruen ends up being even slower, as we'll see when we get to the actual numbers, but that's just a comparison. So in game, it's not a huge deal. You can see it translate to about 1 frame. If you put on the VLK instead, it ends up translating to about 2 or 3 frames difference. So that's just something to keep in mind when you are swapping up attachments on these individual weapons. So this next one is a side-by-side recoil test, and what I've done is started them firing at the same time. You can see there's a line right here that the edge of the building where it meets the ground, and I'm firing 60 bullets in each. So for this one on the PKM, I already fired off 40 bullets, and then on the right, I've kept it with the 60. So it's going to be head-to-head, 60 mag versus 60 mag, and then we're going to look a little bit closer at the recoil patterns, so we get a little bit more consistency, because it's hard to find a wall without a bunch of bullet holes in it, but this gives a good representation of how the recoil works. You're going to notice with this one on the left, it pretty much just goes straight up vertical, and a couple bullets fire above the top of the roof here. And then this one goes a little bit up and then diagonally a little bit to the left and then back up, but not nearly as far. You're going to see the magnitude of the recoil is significantly tighter. And that's why I think people sometimes lead to this one, even though the recoil patterns are relatively easy to control. So you'll go ahead and see that right here. They fire at the same time, and you can kind of trace the recoil pattern. You can see where that one's going. And they almost have around the exact same fire rate with the exact same damage. So when it comes to comparing them, it makes it pretty straightforward what's going on. And on this one, you can see this one, the recoil pattern goes up and then to the left, which we're going to look at a little bit more zoomed in with some still shots. And then this one pretty much went all the way vertical. So what that really means is when you have recoil that kind of goes vertical, sometimes it can be hard to take someone off a head glitch because you either aim too low or it's hard to get the line up. But in general, vertical recoil is the easiest to control. When it comes to the ones that angle, as long as the spacing of the bullets, you can see the spacing right here, there's a little bit more bounce between the shots when it comes to the PKM. Like I said, we're going to look at a little bit more zoomed in one, but there's a lot less spacing when it comes to the Bruen. So that's why it might feel a little bit easier, but in general, both real easy recoil patterns to manage. And here's the one that actually separates these weapons the biggest amount. A lot of the stuff we're going to look at, they're fairly close. And PKM is going to come out on top on a lot of these categories. But when you look at this one right here, this is the biggest reason why people will tend to pick the Bruen over the PKM, and that is reload speed. So let's just go ahead and look at this in real time. And so you can see the difference. Both have fired 1 bullets. Obviously, if you have a completely empty mag, that will modify the reloads a little bit. But you can see 2.236 seconds on the right versus this 8.7 on the left. Over 8-second reload is definitely significant, but the way the attachments work in Warzone, The only thing you could really give up on this class setup is probably the monolithic suppressor, but on long range weapons, you almost have to have a suppressor, so you can't substitute that out for maybe like sleight of hand or anything like that. Obviously, keeping in mind that the Bruen is only allotted for 60 bullets, whereas the PKM by default has 100, so you're saving that attachment. You could obviously do the same with the Bruen, but that tends to slow it down, and it also has a slow reload. And obviously with these comparisons, what I'm also trying to compare is with the best class setups possible, which we're going to obviously go over. So we've actually pulled this information from codgundata.com. Obviously, we already showed off the testing a little bit in a private match and did some 60 frame testing. But right here, you can see that the ADS speed is much slower if you're using that VOK. And then the PKM where those line up. We don't really got to worry about the range modifiers because that part really becomes important once we look at the damage over time or time to kill within Warzone when somebody is fully plated and fully health at 100 health. So right here we have the sprint to fire pretty much even because they're both LMGs, tied here. We did test as the Bruen being a little bit faster. We obviously saw that in game. As far as ADS, movement speed, this is strafing. These are relatively close, but they're both going to be slow because they're both LMGs. Even with that attachment that changes it for the Bruen, you still end up with a very slow ADS speed. Vertical recoil, obviously attachments, horizontal bounce, attachments. Hip fire accuracy, they both have terrible hip fire accuracy, and this is a result of putting on longer barrels or the longest barrels. And obviously this is a result of putting on the longest barrels because that's one of the side effects of using long range attachments, is that it will hurt your hip fire spread, and that's just kind of how it works. But you do get this desired bullet velocity, which you can see they're fairly close to each other, only 60 meters per second difference, which is mostly negligible within game. Reload time, obviously we have the 2 reload times there that we kind of tested. This is obviously done at 240 hertz, so there's a little bit of a variance there. And then we got the mag size, the 60 versus 100. So that all lines up. You can see kind of it's pretty close. And then we got the visual representation. Now let's look at the time to kill. So again, I've taken that same DPS chart and I've compared them head to head. And I actually did a little bit of extra editing in these ones so we could see what exactly is going on and what damage ranges these are happening. We have 36 meters. They're basically tied. You can see there's a 1 meter difference. And that's primarily just because of how the rate of fires work. They're very close. Could be a little bit of frame rounding. They're basically identical in terms of damage per second at these various ranges. So when we end up at the same TTK right up to 36 meters, then the PKM ends up outperforming the Bruen from 36 meters all the way up to 51 with the longest range attachment. So that's the monolithic and then the longest barrels that get you the maximum range. When we're comparing those two side by side, 15 meters ends up being pretty significant. So you still will get this up close meltiness that you generally get at that 30-ish meter mark with the Bruen. But that goes all the way up to 51 meters with the PKM, which is disgusting. Then it has a drop off, and again, they're tied. They stay tied all the way up to about 77 meters. And because the Bruen uses the 5.56 ammo, it has that extra damage drop off compared to a lot of the LMGs. So pretty much once you get beyond this 51 meters, the PKM always deals the same amount of damage of 707 milliseconds when you're dealing the chest shots. Obviously headshots you can get a little bit faster time to kill, and then that goes all the way up until infinity, which is disgusting. So you could actually melt someone if you're able to hit those shots. Obviously at range it can be a little bit trickier, just because that's how it works compared to, you know, using maybe something with like a 1300 meters per second like the Kilo. But in general, you could still melt somebody at far ranges. Then right around 77 meters, we have the Bruen that drops off up to 865, which is still an amazing and competitive TTK. It competes with pretty much most of the meta weapons. That's why it's still within the meta. But obviously, if you have the opportunity to kill 150 milliseconds faster, you might want to take advantage of that, especially if this is your long range option and you've kind of decked it out for recoil. And there's different things you can do so that you maybe get a little bit slower ADS, and then maybe you still have something to help you out with additional recoil control. So I think in the head-to-head here, I think the PKM clearly takes it because it is pretty much better or equal to the Bruen at every possible range. So one attachment I did want to talk about when it comes to the PKM is this attachment in general. Right here, there is 2 barrel attachments, which we'll talk about really quickly. We have extended barrel and then the heavy barrel. People are like, oh, this one's bugged, it's glitched because it says recoil control and it doesn't really help. It does help, but it's so minuscule. Like you wouldn't even notice the difference here. But the real reason you would choose the extended barrel over the heavy barrel is the added bullet velocity. you're going to get an extra bullet velocity, which allows it to feel a little bit closer to hit scan, because if your bullet velocity was like 1 million, for example, something absurd. Obviously, we're talking about it being at 1,000. But if it's at 1 million, that means literally when you fire the bullet, it's going to make contact with whatever you see immediately, which is how hit scan feels, because that's how hit scan works. It's instantaneous when you're firing the bullet and it makes contact. So those incremental things that separate one weapon from another could be 800 meters per second versus 1,000 or 1,100, which we saw with the Bruen. This allows you to bridge that gap, so the actual bullets connecting is that much closer, even though the recoil control part of it isn't really a huge factor. So now let's jump into the class setups for each with the various recoil patterns. So here we have the class setups with the recoil pattern. You can see that I've gone with the monolithic suppressor, the extended barrel, which we just talked about, the snatch grip, which helps with recoil control, as well as the faster ADS speed. It's almost as good, it's basically as good as a tac laser, but it helps with recoil control too, which is insane. Probably by far one of the best attachments in the entire game. Then we got the tac laser, which is going to help with ADS speed, a little bit of stabilization. And then you can either go with the Corp Combat Hollow Sight or the VLK. VLK does help a little bit with stabilization and recoil, but for this type of recoil pattern, it's not going to help out significantly. When it comes to the Bruen over here on the right, we've gone with the VLK, the tac laser, 60 round mag, the Summit 26.8 inch barrel for the same things we talked about. A little bit of recoil control, but that extra bullet velocity, even though the range difference between this barrel and the other barrel that it has that's for longer range are almost identical as far as range goes, the bullet velocity on this one, even though you are getting a little bit slower ADS, is still better, which allows it to compete with this, because that drop off could be enough where it's just that much harder to hit shots for average players. It just wouldn't happen. And then we got the monolithic suppressor for the suppressor part of it, and obviously the range and bullet velocity, which it'll help with. When we look at the overall recoil patterns, you can see the PKM has kind of this little wave effect. It just goes vertical, but enough side to side where it could be a little bit trickier to hit someone at range, since this is all magnified, which we saw. This is only 30 bullets. We saw 60 bullets at a little bit further range. It can go up if obviously you're not correcting it, but I think anyone could pull down on their mouse or on their controller on the right analog, right? And then we have the Bruen. It's going to do this little S shape where it goes up, a little curve to the left and up. But the tightness of the bullets, they're almost overlapping in a lot of these cases, which can make it feel more manageable for the average player, because there's not a lot of skipping, which sometimes the skipping it goes in tandem with visual recoil, where your gun is actually shaking and wobbling, which can be a little tricky, which we saw in our EBR video, as well as SKS and the FOW, how big the difference between the visual recoils are on those weapons. So the head-to-head is there. What do you guys think? Team PKM or Team Bruen? I think the Bruen's just slightly easier to use, but overall, I think the PKM is a beast that is slept on, and that I think more people should be using over the current meta because of how strong it is, especially once you get into that 50 plus meters where it maintains that 700 millisecond time to kill. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, learned something new. If you did, please remember to hit that like button. If you're brand new, want to find your way back for more Call of Duty content, just make sure you subscribe with notifications on. I do appreciate all the support on the channel. Thank you for watching. As always, have a great day.